The wind screamed across the Wyoming plateau like a wounded animal, carrying with it ice crystals that stung
What is it?
exposed skin like 1,000 tiny
I don't know
needles.
if I can do this.
Elias Crow pulled his coat tighter around his gaunt frame, his silver-streaked beard already crusted with frost, despite being only 35 years old. The mountains had aged him beyond his years, first taking his wife to fever, then his infant daughter to the brutal winter of '79, and finally his will to belong anywhere that wasn't the open range. His horse, a battle-scarred mare named Sorrow, stumbled through the deepening snow. Christmas Eve, 1883, and here he was, caught in a whiteout between Dead Creek and the abandoned Thorne homestead. The irony wasn't lost on him. Most folks celebrated this night with family, with warmth, with hope for the coming year. Elias had learned to celebrate nothing, expect nothing, feel nothing. It was easier that way, but Sorrow was failing. He could feel her trembling beneath him, her breaths coming in labored huffs that created small clouds in the frigid air. If he didn't find shelter soon, they'd both become frozen monuments to poor judgment and worse timing. Through the swirling white chaos, a dark shape emerged, the old Thorne woodshed, still standing against all odds. Elias had heard rumors that Mara Thorne still lived somewhere on this land, though he hadn't seen her in nearly 15 years. The town had a way of making certain people invisible, and Mara, with her towering height and unusual strength, had been erased from polite society long before she'd reached womanhood. He dismounted with difficulty, his legs stiff from cold and hours in the saddle. Leading Sorrow toward the structure, he noticed something that made his heart quicken. Fresh footprints in the snow, recently made but already filling in. Someone was here. The door wasn't locked. Why would it be out here at the end of the world? Elias pushed it open, and warmth hit him like a physical force. A small fire crackled in a makeshift hearth, and there, silhouetted against the amber light, stood a figure that took his breath away. Mara Thorne had grown into exactly what the cruel townspeople had predicted, and nothing like what they'd actually meant. She stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, her shoulders broad enough to carry burdens that would break most men, but her face, turned toward him in the firelight, held a gentleness that contradicted every harsh word ever spoken about her. Her hair, dark as a raven's wing, fell in thick waves past her shoulders, and she wore inexplicably a wedding dress, yellowed with age, obviously handmade, beautiful in its simplicity and heartbreaking in its implications. "Elias Crow," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something else, something like recognition of a kindred spirit. "I wondered if you'd finally frozen to death out there." "Not yet," he managed, his teeth chattering, though not for lack of trying. She stepped aside, gesturing to the space near the fire. "Bring your horse in. There's room, and she'll die out there." It wasn't a normal thing. Bringing a horse into a shelter meant for wood storage, but nothing about this night was normal. Elias led Sorrow inside, and Mara immediately moved to help, her large hands gentle as she removed the saddle and began rubbing down the mare with an old blanket. "You're good with animals," Elias observed, watching her work with an efficiency born of long practice. "Animals don't judge," Mara replied simply. "They don't care if you're too tall or too strong or too different. They just care if you're kind." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Elias remembered the Mara from childhood, always the tallest in any group, even taller than the boys by the time she was 12. He remembered the day Tommy Fletcher had called her a giant freak and how she'd run away crying. He remembered wanting to follow her, wanting to say something, but lacking the courage because he was afraid the other boys would turn on him too. Shame, old and familiar, settled in his gut. "Why the dress?" he asked, partly to break the silence and partly because he genuinely wanted to know. Mara looked down at herself, as if she'd forgotten what she was wearing. A sad smile crossed her face. "My mother made it. She said every woman should have a wedding dress, even if—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Even if no one would ever marry her. "She died last winter," Mara continued, her voice steady, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Pneumonia? Before she went, she made me promise I'd wear this dress on Christmas Eve every year as a reminder that hope isn't dead, that somewhere, somehow, there might be someone who—" Again, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Elias felt something crack in the frozen wasteland of his chest, a hairline fracture in the ice he'd built around his heart. "My wife died 4 years ago," he heard himself say. "Fever, and my daughter, she was only 6 months old when the winter took her. Sometimes I think I died with them, but my body just forgot to stop moving." Mara looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw recognition in her eyes. Not pity. He'd seen enough pity to last a lifetime, but understanding. She knew what it meant to be hollowed out by loss, to keep going because stopping would mean acknowledging the void. "We're quite a pair," she said softly. "The lonely cowboy and the bride nobody wants." "That's where you're wrong," Elias said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Not wanting you and being too afraid to want you, those are different things." She froze, her hand stilling on Sorrow's flank. "What do you mean?" He moved closer to the fire, partly for warmth and partly to buy himself time to find the right words. "I remember you, Mara, from when we were kids. You were always kind. You'd share your lunch with anyone who looked hungry. You'd help the smaller kids reach things on high shelves. You had this laugh that sounded like music, I guess, like joy itself." "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "Yeah, it was. And you want to know what I remember most?" He turned to face her fully. "I remember being 12 years old and thinking you were the prettiest girl I'd ever seen. And then I remember being too much of a coward to say so because the other boys would have mocked me. I let their fear become my fear. I'm sorry for that. I've been sorry for that for more than 20 years. Mara's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like that young girl again, uncertain, hopeful, terrified of disappointment. You thought I was pretty?" "I thought you were magnificent," Elias corrected. "Still do." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're just saying that because we're trapped here together, because the storm makes everyone vulnerable and sentimental. Maybe," he admitted, "or maybe the storm just strips away all the bullshit we use to protect ourselves from the truth." He took a step toward her. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Has anyone ever held your hand, Mara? Not to shake it in greeting or pull you somewhere, but just to hold it, to feel your skin against theirs and think, this is where I want to be?" The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "No," she whispered. "Never." Elias reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand, in both of his. Her hand was nearly twice the size of his own, calloused from hard work, strong enough to snap his wrist with minimal effort, and it was trembling like a bird's wing. "The world is full of fools," he said softly, "myself included. We see something different, something that doesn't fit our narrow expectations, and we call it wrong. But different isn't wrong. Sometimes different is just rare, precious, worth protecting." "I'm not precious," Mara said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm the woman children are afraid of, the one mothers use as a cautionary tale. Be good, or the giant woman will take you away. That's who I am." "That's who they made you think you are," Elias countered. "But that's not who you are to me. To me, you're the woman who brought her horse inside to save its life, the woman who keeps her mother's promise even though it breaks her heart, the woman who's strong enough to survive alone but gentle enough to care for things weaker than herself." Mara pulled her hand away, but not in rejection, in self-protection. "Why are you saying these things? What do you want from me?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the fire on his face and the cold reality of his life settling around him. "I'm 35 years old, and I've been dead inside for 4 years. I've spent every Christmas since my daughter died trying to forget it was Christmas. I ride through blizzards and sleep under stars and tell myself that solitude is freedom. But it's not. It's just emptiness." He paused, gathering courage he didn't know he still possessed. "Tonight, looking at you in that dress your mother made, hearing you talk about hope and promises, I feel something I thought was gone forever. I feel alive, and it terrifies me because I know when morning comes and the storm clears, I'll ride away and you'll go back to your life, and we'll both go back to being alone. Unless—" "Unless what?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Unless we decide that two broken people might make one whole life," he said. "Unless we admit that loneliness isn't noble or necessary, and that maybe, just maybe, we deserve something better than slowly freezing to death in our separate corners of this godless territory." Mara stared at him, her chest rising and falling with emotion. "You don't know me. Not really. You're imagining something that isn't there. By tomorrow, when the snow stops and you can see clearly again, you'll realize I'm just what I've always been. Too much, too big, too strange." Elias stepped closer, close enough that he had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. "You want to know what I see? I see a woman who's been told her entire life that she's too much, when the truth is that everyone else is too small. Too small in their thinking, too small in their hearts, too small in their courage. But I'm not small, Mara. I've stared down death more times than I can count. I've lost everything that mattered, and I'm telling you, right now, on Christmas Eve in a woodshed in the middle of nowhere, that you are exactly what I've been looking for without knowing I was looking." "This is crazy," she breathed. "Probably," he agreed, "but I've done the sane thing, the careful thing, and it left me hollow. Maybe crazy is what I need." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire popped and hissed, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind continued its mournful wail, but inside, something was shifting, some fundamental rearrangement of two solitary souls finding an unexpected harmony. "I don't know how to do this," Mara finally said. No one has ever—" "Neither have I," Elias said. "Not like this. not with someone who understands what it's like to be alone in a room full of people. "You're afraid," she observed, and he realized she was right. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold he'd brought in with him. "Terrified," he admitted, "absolutely terrified, because if I let myself hope and it doesn't work out, I don't think I'll survive it. I'm already hanging on by a thread, Mara. You, might be the thing that either saves me or finally breaks me completely." She reached out, and this time she took his hand, engulfing it in her own. "Then we're both terrified," she said, "and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's how you know something matters, because the risk of losing it actually frightens you." They stood like that for a while, hands clasped, the fire warming their bodies while something else, something fragile and new, warmed their souls. And then Elias, in a voice rough with emotion and need and a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself in years, said the words that would change everything. "Mara, I need to be close to someone, to you. Just for tonight, let me pretend I'm not alone. Let me pretend someone in this world gives a damn whether I live or die." He swallowed hard. "Please, I'm asking, no, I'm begging, let me in, not just into this shed, but into whatever space you're willing to share, because I can't do another Christmas alone. I just can't." The raw honesty of it hung between them like a physical thing. There was no manipulation in his words, no calculation, just desperation and hope, and the kind of loneliness that could kill a person more surely than any winter storm. Mara's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different, not tears of sadness or self-pity, but of recognition and release. Someone needed her, not her strength or her ability to reach high shelves or her capacity for hard labor. Someone needed her heart, her presence, her humanity. "Yes," she whispered, and the words seemed to fill the small space with possibility. "Yes, come closer, stay, let me—" She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she pulled him gently toward her, and despite their difference in height and size, they fit together in a way that defied logic but embraced truth. She wrapped her arms around him, and he buried his face in her shoulder, and for the first time in 4 years, Elias Crow wept. He wept for his wife, cold in the ground. He wept for his daughter, who never got to see her first birthday. He wept for all the years he'd spent pushing people away and all the nights he'd wished desperately that someone would push back, would refuse to let him disappear into the wilderness of his own grief. And Mara held him. This woman, who'd been told she was too strong, who'd been made to feel like her very existence was an imposition, discovered that strength could be gentle, that holding someone who was falling apart was perhaps the most important use of power. When his tears finally subsided, Elias pulled back just enough to look up at her. Her face was blotchy from crying too, crying for him, for herself, for all the years of isolation they'd both endured. "I haven't cried in front of another person since I was a child," he said. "Then I'm honored," she replied simply. He reached up, his hand shaking, and touched her face. She leaned into the touch like a cat starved for affection, her eyes closing briefly. When they opened again, there was a question in them, one she was afraid to ask. Elias answered it anyway. "I meant what I said, about you being magnificent. Mara, I want to know what it's like to be close to you, really close, to touch and be touched by someone who understands what it means to survive, to know that for one night, neither of us has to be alone." "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I'm not? I've never—" "Neither have I," he interrupted. "Not like this, not with intention and choice and care. With my wife it was expected. Duty and affection mixed together, but always shadowed by what society required. But this would be because we want it, because we choose it, because we're both brave enough to reach for something real instead of settling for the cold comfort of isolation." Mara took a shuddering breath. "I'm afraid I'll hurt you. I'm so much bigger, so much stronger." "Then be gentle," he said, "and trust me to tell you if something's wrong. Trust me to be here, fully present, choosing this, choosing you, with my eyes wide open." She nodded slowly, and then, with infinite care, she lowered herself to the blankets she'd spread near the fire. Elias followed, his movements deliberate, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for him again, and this time, when they came together, it was with purpose. What happened next in that small woodshed on Christmas Eve was not the fevered passion of romance novels or the crude mechanics of purely physical desire. It was something rarer and more profound. Two damaged people finding comfort in each other's arms, offering and accepting vulnerability in equal measure. Mara discovered that her strength could cradle rather than crush, that her size could shelter rather than intimidate. Elias learned that surrendering didn't mean weakness, that asking for help wasn't failure, that being seen in his brokenness didn't diminish him. It made him real again. They moved slowly, carefully, each touch a question and an answer. The wedding dress, sacred symbol of her mother's hopes, was removed with reverence and folded gently aside. The rough clothes of the frontier cowboy were shed like armor, no longer needed. And in the firelight, two scarred bodies found a wordless conversation, a physical dialogue about loneliness and healing, about the courage it takes to let another person see you completely. Afterward, they lay together in the flickering warmth, Elias's head on Mara's shoulder, her large hand stroking his hair with a tenderness that belied her feared strength. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the wind's howl fading to a mournful whisper. "What happens when morning comes?" Mara asked, voicing the fear that lurked beneath their fragile happiness. Elias was quiet for a long moment, and she felt her heart beginning to contract in anticipation of inevitable disappointment. He would leave. Of course he would. This was just one night, an aberration brought on by desperation and circumstance. By tomorrow, he would remember who he was, a respected, if solitary cowboy, and who she was, the town's cautionary tale. But then he spoke, and his words shattered her expectations. "When morning comes," he said slowly, "I'm going to ride into Dead Creek. I'm going to the general store, and I'm going to buy a ring. Nothing fancy. We're not fancy people, just a simple band that says, 'I choose you.' And then I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to ask you properly, not in desperation or fear, but in hope. I'm going to ask you to marry me, Mara Thorne, and mean it with every scarred, broken, healing piece of my heart." She stopped breathing. "You can't. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said, propping himself up on one elbow so he could see her face. "That's the whole point. This isn't about obligation or debt or trying to make an honest woman out of you or any of that garbage. This is about waking up and realizing that the best thing that's ever happened to me was getting caught in a blizzard on Christmas Eve. This is about refusing to waste another day of my life pretending that being alone is preferable to being with you. People will talk, she warned. They'll say terrible things. They'll say you married me out of pity or that I trapped you somehow. They'll never accept us. Then we won't give them the opportunity, Elias said firmly. We'll build a life out here away from Dead Creek and its small-minded inhabitants. We'll homestead up in the Medicine Bow Range, where the land is hard but beautiful, where our nearest neighbor will be 10 miles away and won't give a damn what we do. We'll build a cabin large enough for you to stand up straight in, with a bed big enough for both of us. We'll raise horses and maybe some cattle, and in the winter we'll sit by the fire and tell each other stories. And if we're lucky, if we're very lucky, maybe we'll have children who grow up knowing they're loved exactly as they are, no matter how tall or short or different they might be. Tears were streaming down Mara's face now. You're offering me everything I'd given up hoping for. Then say yes, he urged. Not tonight, in the aftermath of comfort and need, but tomorrow, in the cold light of day. Let me ask you properly, and you can answer with a clear head and a full heart. But know this, Mara, I'm going to ask. I'm going to hope. And whatever your answer is, I won't regret this night. I won't regret finally being brave enough to choose life over mere survival. She pulled him close, holding him with all the careful strength she possessed. Ask me now, she whispered fiercely. I don't need daylight to know my answer. I don't need a ring or a proper proposal or any of the trappings. I just need you to ask. Elias's breath caught. Mara Thorne, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my home? Will you let me spend the rest of my days proving that you are exactly what I need, exactly who I want, exactly enough? Yes, she breathed. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. They sealed the promise with a kiss, gentle and deep, tasting of salt from shared tears and smoke from the dying fire. And as Christmas Day dawned over the Wyoming wilderness, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold, two people who'd believed themselves beyond hope discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow and new possibility. Elias and Mara emerged from the woodshed into the brilliant morning, Sorrow snorting contentedly after her warm night's rest. They stood together, his hand in hers, surveying a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. We should go into town, Elias said. Get that ring. Let everyone see that I'm choosing this, choosing you, with pride, not shame. Are you sure? Mara asked, old insecurities dying hard. I've never been more sure of anything, he said firmly. And if anyone has something to say about it, they can say it to my face, and then they can watch me not give a damn. So they rode into Dead Creek together, Elias on Sorrow, and Mara walking beside them, still wearing her mother's wedding dress, because there seemed no reason to hide any more. The sight of them caused quite a stir. The solitary cowboy and the giant woman side by side, both of them wearing expressions of defiant joy. At the general store, old Mr. Hartley's eyes widened when Elias announced his intention to buy a wedding ring. The old man started to say something, probably something cautionary or judgmental, but then he looked at Elias's face, at the determination and happiness there, and wisely held his tongue. He produced a simple gold band, nothing fancy, but perfect in its plainness. Elias paid for it, then turned to Mara right there in the middle of the store with curious townspeople gathering at the windows. He took her hand, that large, strong, gentle hand, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It was too small by several sizes, but Mara clutched it fiercely, tears shining in her eyes. "We'll get it resized," Elias said, "or I'll buy you a different one, or we'll tie a string around it to make it fit. I don't care. I just need everyone here to know that you're mine and I'm yours, and that's the end of it." Someone in the gathered crowd laughed, not unkindly, but with genuine amusement and perhaps even approval. It was Mrs. Chen, the seamstress, who'd always been kind to Mara when others weren't. About damn time someone had the sense to see what was right in front of them, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, and just like that, the ice broke. Not everyone would accept them. Prejudice died hard in small towns, but enough people did. Enough people were willing to acknowledge that sometimes the most unlikely pairings made the most sense. That sometimes different wasn't wrong, just rare. That sometimes strength came in packages nobody expected, and love even more so. They were married a week later in a simple ceremony on Mara's land, with Mrs. Chen and old Mr. Hartley as witnesses. Mara wore her mother's dress, properly fitted now thanks to Mrs. Chen's skilled needle. Elias wore his cleanest shirt and a smile that made him look 10 years younger. And when they said their vows, promising to honor and protect each other, to be home for each other in a harsh and unforgiving world, there wasn't a dry eye among the small gathering. That night, in the cabin they were already building together, Elias held his wife close and marveled at the strange, wonderful path that had brought them here. A blizzard, a desperate need for shelter, a wedding dress worn as a symbol of defiant hope, and two lonely souls brave enough to choose each other despite everything the world had told them about who they should be and how they should live. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Mara asked, her voice rumbling pleasantly against his cheek where it rested on her shoulder. "For not giving up, for keeping your mother's promise, for wearing that dress and being in that woodshed and saying yes when I asked, for being exactly who you are, because who you are is exactly who I need." She squeezed him gently, carefully, with the controlled strength of someone who finally understood her own power. "We saved each other," she said. "On Christmas Eve in a storm, we saved each other." And it was true. Two broken people, each carrying their own griefs and losses and loneliness, had found in each other not a cure, but a companion. Someone to share the burden. Someone to witness the pain and say, "I see you, and you're not alone." Years later, when their children asked how they met, Elias and Mara would tell them the truth, that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as disasters, that getting lost can be the first step toward finding your way home, and that being different isn't a curse. It's an invitation to find others who are brave enough to be different too. They built their life in the shadow of the Medicine Bow Mountains, raising horses and children with equal care. Their home became known as a place where misfits were welcome, where being unusual was celebrated rather than condemned. And every Christmas Eve, Mara would put on her mother's wedding dress, and Elias would hold her hand, and they would remember the night that changed everything, the night they decided that loneliness was a choice they no longer needed to make. The lonely cowboy and the giant bride. Different, certainly. Unlikely. Absolutely. But together they were something neither had been apart. Whole, happy, and finally, blessedly home.